Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible.com. Get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/usingyourpower. Over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. For today's show, I'd like to recommend Blockchain Revolution, how the technology behind Bitcoin is changing money, business, and the world. A long and epic book written by Don and Alex Tapscott. Welcome to Using Your Power. I'm David Andrew Wiebe, and joining me is...
It's Maveen, Kaura.
How you doing, Maveen?
I'm doing great, man. How are you?
I'm powered up.
Are you? What's so powering you up?
This podcast.
Yeah?
Yeah, it's a lot of fun to do.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, man. Well, it's good, right? It's two people getting together and just talking about things that are on their mind and how they feel the state of the world is going, I guess, based on the topics we talk about.
I feel like it's a really great outlet for a lot of things that I learn and study and find out. And I don't necessarily have the opportunity to share on something like The Music Entrepreneur because obviously the focus there is going to be music and not other interesting topics necessarily.
Right. Well, there's a million other topics under the sun other than music, so I'm glad me and you've actually talked about this and we decided to put this together.
Yeah, we better get going. We got so many topics.
Well, we do. And, we're recording, number 13 today?
I believe, number 13.
That'd be awesome, man. So why don't you take it off and see where we go with this?
We're talking about aging, science, and technology. Well, I think we all age. There's no way of taking that back. All that is passage of time, and time is kind of a human construct in a way because quantum physics shows that time is kind of irrelevant. But it's perception, Sometimes time seems to go fast. Sometimes time seems to go slow. And, Albert Einstein explained it by saying time is relative. So it's an interesting concept, but I think we see it in nature. We see it amongst each other as human beings. And it's going to change a lot, I think, with the emergence of new science and technology.
No, I fully agree with you. I wasn't expecting you to say any of that right off the bat. So that's pretty deep stuff right off there. But you're right? With the science just kind of working and trying to figure out, the miracle drugs and the fountain of youth and all that, right? So, you're right in the fact that, time is very relative, and it's funny how you say that, right? You go out anywhere, let's say you go out for a night out on the evening on town here, and you can go 4 or 5 hours that pass, and it only feels like 10 minutes. You might watch a quick TV show, and 2 hours, 3 hours later, it only felt like 15 minutes that you've been watching, but it's gone so quick, right? Too.
Exactly.
And then time slowing down. If you ever been to work, time never moves when you're at work. It's really slow. Or for those students that we have listening as well, when we were in school, sometimes time just seems to go so slow.
Or like when you're traveling, like time doesn't seem to pass very quickly. And then you feel like you've packed so much in your day, like even just a 3-hour drive to Edmonton for us, that would feel like it was a really long time. And then if we did a bunch of other things that day, we would feel like we packed in a ton of stuff. Whereas like an average work day, you might feel like you've accomplished very little or nothing by the end of it. So.
No, you're right. It is relative, like you said, to what you're doing and maybe how fast you're going too, depending if you're in a car, right? So yeah. I know it's a 3-hour trip at recommended speeds of 100, but there are people who drive a lot faster, and that trip can be done a lot faster than that.
2.5 hours, 2 hours maybe?
I think the fastest I ever did it, and it was an hour and 45 minutes.
Wow.
To be honest, we were going fast.
I believe it. Well, I think part of this whole aging thing is it's actually a scary subject for a lot of people, but it ties in a lot with things we've talked about before too, especially with pharmaceuticals. Maybe I should just wait for that moment to actually reference that a little bit further with drugs and things like that. But you mentioned elixirs and fountain of youth and stuff like that too, so we'll get into all that. I wanted to talk a little bit about like how many years a human being can realistically live to. And I think most people feel like that age is maybe somewhere between 65 and 80. but the human body is fully capable of living to be 100 and 120 even. And we can see that from the blue zone, the so-called blue zones of the world, like Okinawa or the Himalayas, if I'm not mistaken.
No, you're right, definitely.
Yeah, where
That's some of the areas.
people kind of, they get regular exercise, they have community, they don't worry too much about a lot of stuff. And those are some of the reasons, I mean, they eat well too, but those are some of the reasons why they live to be that age. And I think we're fast approaching where that's going to be accessible or like attainable for the average person to live to be 120. But it does depend a lot on government control. As long as control is centralized, what benefit do they have in allowing people to live to that age? Same with the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, we're trying to get people in a subscription program here of drugs. So what incentive do they have to let people live longer? Or maybe there is an incentive because they'll stay on the subscription program for longer. So I guess you could take that view as well.
Well, that's very true. Now, before I get into that with you, I wanted to actually give our listeners a couple of little facts here. David, what do you think?
Yeah, I would love to hear some facts.
Awesome, man. So the oldest known person right now that's living is that was living was 122 years old and 164 days.
Yes.
Okay. Now, here's another cool fact. So 18 out of 20 of the oldest people ever recorded were women. So only 2% were men.
Right.
Now, I do like the fact that there's a study that came out, a report that came out, I guess I should say, in January 2016. They actually had a man in Brazil, which they have confirmed through his passport, funny enough, which is a government-issued document, but they're not 100% going to stand by it either. But they said he was 131 years old.
Wow.
Now, again, he's the oldest recorded man, but again, it's still kind of being debated if they're going to use the documentation they have to prove that, right? So,
right. So they're not even sure.
Say again?
So they're not even sure.
Yeah, they're not even sure, right? So, but I mean, it's a documented passport given by the government. So, I mean, you would think the Guinness Book of World Records would allow that to be evidence of his age.
To be recognized.
He's got a daughter, he's got a wife, obviously a lot younger his wife is than him, but they've been together for 40 years. Or so it's pretty interesting, or 30 years it was, something like that. So I thought that was interesting. And kind of the other thing to kind of put in perspective of what you're saying was there's the areas in Pakistan, it's a place in the Hunza Valley, I hope I say that correctly, that most people in that area have lived up to 100 and have not had many cases where people have diseases like cancer. So it's very interesting. And the biggest thing that they were doing that's being recorded is they have a diet that's high in flaxseed.
Wow. Yeah, and I think that was another thing too, was diet of coconut oil in some cases. Like, that's not necessarily available locally everywhere, but that can also be a contributor to a longer life, supposedly. And it's actually becoming a lot more popular, as you've probably noticed. I use coconut oil in my cooking generally, and sometimes I'll even just grab a spoonful, knowing some of the health benefits and things like that. So
yeah, no, that's an excellent way to do it, right? There's so many different uses for coconut oil, and
yep.
I mean, you can find tons of them on the internet. One of the things I do as well, and you've come over and had a bulletproof coffee with me too, and it's just putting it in my coffee, mixing with butter and blending them too, right? And
it's great stuff.
Yeah, and using it for that brain food that I think a lot of us are potentially lacking sometimes these days.
Exactly. I think one of the things that I wanted to set forth a little bit was how would it change your viewpoint on life to think of 60 years old as being mid-age? Because a lot of people have a tendency of thinking 60 is kind of towards the end of my life. And a lot of people don't even feel like maybe they function properly at that point. There's a lot of reasons for that, inflammation and food and some of the other factors. Like, you do need to clear out some of that stuff out of your body in order to feel well. But we think of mid-age in society as being like 40, right?
Well, you have a great point. Now, I think back in the medieval days, I think 40 was old, and that's what they had considered to be old, or even younger than that. You know, people were getting married even younger than what we get married nowadays. Like yourself, you're in your 30s, you're not married yet. I didn't get married until I was in my 30s. Now, more and more people are starting to wait longer and longer before they get married.
It's fairly common now. Yeah.
Right. And, you know, as we're getting to opportunities to be older, you know, things are just kind of spreading out a little bit further. But, you know, statistics still say that most people will, you know, potentially die by the time they're 68, right? So, I mean, there's still stats in place that are, you know, you can check on any government website that says it, right? Which is kind of sad. So,
well, it is a centralized source of information. So, you know, there is that too, but.
No, absolutely. But, you know, to the point of statistics, at least, you know, numbers don't lie, right? I mean, you can see it all around you. You can hear stories of people dying in their 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s.
Absolutely.
All the time, right? So, I mean, I will take it with a grain of salt that, you know, there are still a lot more people. It seems to me that there's a lot of baby boomers right now out there, and, you know, they will eventually start to pass as well. I think one of the big things that we were really wanting to also look at was how could you even prolong it, right? So there's two ways, I believe, that we are going to discuss. Is one is naturally getting there, and one is through science getting there.
Yeah, exactly. You got it right. I want to take a brief tangent and just kind of discuss the strictly hypothetical and theoretical as well, which is you know, recorded documents in the Bible. It talks about people that live to be hundreds of years old. So, you know, you talked about the medieval times and how people only lived to be 40, but history shows us that going back several thousand years, people may have lived to be hundreds of years old, unless that was some kind of metaphor or analogy or, you know, some other way of describing the long life that they lived.
Right. And, you know, just being on the technology side of things for the Bible, I'm not sure if you've heard of the show Ancient Aliens or not.
Yeah, I have.
You know, there's some huge debate on, you know, depending on if you like the thinking and the theories that people have presented from that show are, you know, saying that, you know, potentially these people who lived to the ages of 3, 4, 5, 900 years old weren't actually humans, right? They were potentially beings from another world or another planet who were here that long. I mean, we can look at any human being, and I put that in quotations, in recorded history, and again, this history that's being told to us, not necessarily studied by every one of us, right? We're kind of taking a lot of this stuff on face value as well, right? So based on what we're being told and heard and understood to believe, is that these people, most people only live to a certain age, right? You know, 30s, 40s, maybe 50s. That was considered old. Look at people like Confucius, even prior to the Bible being written, or even, I guess, maybe, at least before even Jesus' time, right? And maybe closer to the time of the First Testament, I believe it is, before the New Testament. So a lot of that is also being said in there. Now, you have to, I think, take a lot of this with a grain of salt. If you do believe that these people live to these ages, then you have to ask, well, how was it possible?
Exactly. I think, you know, that's one possible explanation for how it went there. But yeah, let's get back to your point about aging naturally or aging through science and technology and some of the emerging fields there. I think getting there naturally, like, I'm not a doctor and Maveen's not a doctor, and we're not nutritionists or anything like that. So we couldn't necessarily tell you how to get there, but I think the basics totally apply. Resting, sleeping well, eating well, getting exercise, having strong relationships around you. I think there's a lot of people with not many friends, but even if you do live to be 70, 80, 90, 100, also many of your friends may have passed away by that point too. And so I think it's, you know, you sort of have to renew your spirit and not become jaded and cynical because people pass on. You'd have to be the kind of person that's willing to go out again and again and again and continue to make new friendships and new relationships and go deep with them.
No, you're right, David, and you have to look at other things too, such as I think aging and dying is sometimes just a chance, right? You see people out there who smoke, who drink. They're not only damaging their cells and their liver and their lungs, and these guys, you see them living until 80, 90 years old, natural,
Yep.
and dying of natural causes, not of cancer. And then you hear about people who are fully active and pass away from cancer, right? So there's something to be said about, I think, chance of how long you're going to live as well, right? I think that's one of the things that makes life very interesting, is not knowing when you're going to go or from what you're going to go from.
I think there's also maybe a lot of genetic or environmental factors that we couldn't possibly know about, because you're right, sometimes these athletes that work out every single day and push really hard die at a young age, maybe in their 20s, maybe in their 30s. Sometimes it's cancer, and sometimes it's an aneurysm on the spot. So yeah, we really don't know. And I don't think there's really any way of predicting it. I mean, we can kind of say somewhat based on genetics, environmental circumstances, job, what kind of environment you work in, and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, really, you can't say when someone's going to die.
No, you can't. And like I said, that's, I think, the cool part about being alive today. And in no other time in history,
Yeah.
we're being able to record and tell people kind of how we feel, and share those same thoughts with other people. And some people may completely dismiss everything we're saying, right? But that's kind of the time we live in, right? The social media world, and having the ability to communicate with people and tell them about aging, right? And that's what I mean with going back to the statistics, say that people will die from certain things right now. I think those statistics will start changing as well, because I think our environmental influences are also changing as well, right? So one of the things you mentioned earlier was diet, right? More and more are people starting to consume sugar, right? And flour and all these things. And you can see that the environment, believe in the ozone layer being depleted or not. I mean, I'm not going to get into that talk today, but
Might be another subject for another time.
yeah, but you can see how, there's more pollutants, right? The more people we have on this planet, the more carbon footprint that we create as well, right? You can look into the two of the biggest countries out there, China and India, and just look at them. They have over 2 billion, or 1/3 of the planet, living in those two countries, right? And just look at the carbon footprint that's being created there. And of course, that pollutants also spread around the world. And not getting too deep into the movement of food and whatnot, but I mean, things are being sold and bought all over the world and being brought to North America and sold back and forth. And I mean, some of the pollutants that are in the ground over there are also coming here for our consumption, and that is also going to affect how we age as well.
Yeah, I can't remember the exact figures Tony Robbins cited in his book Money, but he was talking about how as people, like, we're as a population, as human beings, we're not really growing at a steady, consistent rate. We're also maybe not necessarily growing exponentially, but we are multiplying. And then the next 20 years, we could have tens of billions of people. We're not talking about 7 billion or 6 billion people. We could be tens of billions of people, like 20, 30 billion, something along those lines. So, I mean, I don't know if we're headed that way or not, but you're right. We're progressively taking over the earth in a way.
No, for sure. And, depending on your study and your thoughts and belief, I don't think, that this is the first time we've taken over an Earth-like planet. I think that we've, as a beings on this planet, have probably done this and depleted the resources of other planets many times. It's kind of, if you look into what science is looking to do right now, right? They're looking, exploring different planets right now, one being Mars, looking to send people to Mars and do some exploration. That Matt Damon movie was a perfect example, right? Like, things that they've thought of as growing your own food on a planet
Elysium.
like Mars and whatnot.
Right. Elysium, is that the movie you were thinking of?
No, I can't. Mission to Mars, I think.
Oh,
like that.
yeah, right.
I don't remember the exact name.
I know
anymore,
what you're talking about now. Yeah.
Yeah, he goes out there and he grows his own food and uses compost and whatnot.
Yeah, potatoes.
So, yeah, and exactly. And these things, if people can think about doing that from the planet Earth and have the ability to think like that, what makes you think people haven't already done something like this already? If those thoughts can happen, it can be created as well.
Right. So, in other words, like the things that we see on the big screens and on TV and in the media and stuff like that, which are supposedly quote unquote science fiction, might have their roots in reality. And I think that's actually shown through some novels that have been written by science fiction authors. They once wrote about it, and then it actually became a development later on. It's almost like a prophetic message in a way. So I think that kind of thing happens.
Well, for sure. Look at even the most popular movies out right now, stuff like Star Wars and Star Trek, right? They do take place in galaxies far, far away. I hope I don't get sued for saying that by
No, I
George
don't
Lucas
think
or
so.
Disney, but it's true. Like, these are stories that happen on different planets and different worlds, and you see how those people are looking and the perception of what those characters will look like, how different they look than us human beings, right? And how you'll see all these people living in harmony, not necessarily always, but most of these different people that look very different from me and you, they are living happily, it looks like.
Yeah, that's a very interesting, but I think it's an important consideration. It's with regards to like technology, because what if we could go in space? We know that the construct of time works differently in space, and maybe if we were suspended in space as opposed to living on Earth, we could live longer, or maybe we would live shorter because we're further from the sun and things like that. So all those kinds of considerations could certainly play into people's lifespan. I don't think we're anywhere near the point where we can take dozens, let alone hundreds and thousands of people up into space like in Star Trek. But those days might be, 20, 30, 40, maybe even 100 years off.
Right. Well, and we could already be doing it and no one knows, right? So
that's true too.
I mean, we don't know exactly what happens.
I don't know what's happening in Area 51.
No, that's another topic right there by itself. But it's true, right? I mean, we don't really know, but let's go with what I think most people probably believe. Let's believe that everything that's happening around us is the truth. Let's just talk in those confines. It's easier to talk in what people perceive as a reality happening right now than based on things people can't necessarily see because they maybe don't want to believe it, or they can't see it, so they can't fathom that that's actually potentially happening, right? So, I mean, if it's happening, okay, but we do see and hear about missions going into space, and then the scientists that are working on just checking out different bone densities and how to grow food and how our bodies go through the process of aging and our bone density and all that different scientific experiments they've done, not just on humans, but they have taken animals up into space as well to test that as well, right? So I mean, whatever those results have been, I'm not very sure because I have never really read into those. But if people that are listening are very interested, I would recommend going to those websites and taking a read of what's kind of being found out there, and kind of decide for yourself what you believe.
Yeah, and let us know in the comments what you find, because we're interested too. I think with aging with science and technology offers some possibilities and some opportunities for us to potentially live longer, and I think that's kind of where we're driving with this episode in a way too. Basically, things like 3D printing, which so many people talk about the application of building homes and how cheap that's going to become with 3D printing, but there seems to be so many other applications to which it could potentially apply. It's kind of our own version of the replicator on Star Trek in a way. We could have the potential to 3D print organs, like vital human organs, and I think that technology is coming along pretty quickly, meaning you could probably replace anything that isn't working right, and also reduce the chances of your body rejecting somebody else's vital organ that you need to survive. And we also know that people often wait a long time for those kinds of surgeries too, to try to get organs replaced that they need to live.
No, you got a good point, David, and I think that brings up another issue as well, especially when we're talking about organs and whatnot. So, it depends. And I have a different philosophy from you potentially, and even from our listeners, right? Like, we have to look at why these organs need to be replaced, right? Is it something that the damage has been caused naturally? Is this something that the people have done to themselves, right? I mean, you hear about all the time there are people have liver damage because of excessive drinking, or like we were talking about smoking or whatnot, right? I mean, these are damages damages that people have done to themselves because they have an addiction, right? So then it comes into, well, do you give the people that heart or that, that lung, or do you give them that liver because they deserve it, or does somebody else deserve it who has not done that to themselves and put them in that position, right? It's more of a natural cause. So it does come into an idea of who would get that transplant first. But I mean, with 3D printing, I'm assuming that you'd be able to, produce hundreds and thousands at one time, right?
Exactly.
So, and you can potentially even stockpile these things. But then it comes into what is the cost to sell to somebody in the procedure as well.
Yeah, well, I think with 3D printing, if we're talking about printing homes and building entire communities with that, I would guess that printing an organ is much easier to do. So I see what you're saying. Somebody who's gone through their life smoking or deliberately ruining their bodies, should they actually get, have an opportunity to get those organs replaced? I can't really tell you. I just know that it's an opportunity that's kind of staring us in the face.
Right. Well, it is nice because a lot of these people, were or got addicted to a lot of this stuff not in their own doing, right? I mean, it is the same pharmaceutical companies that do put out the different drugs that people get addicted to, and not only just drugs, but I mean, and again, we're just talking about one thing, like cigarettes or even alcohol, right? So not saying good or bad about either one of them. It's your choice to want to smoke. It's your choice to want to drink. It's your choice to want to consume these things, right? I mean,
exactly.
I was telling you right before this, I tried smoking. I really couldn't understand the point of it. I logically couldn't make sense of why I'd want to spend, $9, $10, $20 a pack to kill myself in the end, right?
It's crazy, yeah.
It just didn't make mental sense to me. But like we were talking about before we started recording this, there's other things I'm sure I'm addicted to, that because every one of us do have some sort of addictive personality, right? And maybe that addiction that I have is killing me, maybe it's not, right? And if it's not killing me physically, it may be killing me mentally or spiritually, or maybe a different way of financially potentially as well.
Yeah. Another opportunity that is potentially staring us in the face. I wish I could describe this more eloquently because I heard it on a podcast, probably like the James Altucher show or something like that. But we're fast coming to the point now too, where we could regenerate limbs. It used to be if it was burned off or cut off or sawed off, there might be a chance that if you brought it in to the doctor and put it on ice and do everything right, that you might be able to get it sewn back on. But we're now coming to the point where limbs could probably easily be regenerated with the new technology that's coming out. So that's not a reason to go out and lose a limb, but in the unfortunate event that you do, there's now the possibility probably within the next however many years to actually regenerate a limb that you've lost.
Wow, that's actually very interesting, right? I mean, there are a lot of people who go to war and lose limbs and hands and arms, and
yeah,
and it takes a long time for them to get used to living like, I guess, living with something they used to have, right? It even goes for eyesight as well, right? I mean, it's an organ that someone can lose, and then potentially you can replace somebody's eyes and allow them to see the same way they used to, or grab something, maybe hug a child that they can't hug anymore, or walk over and do just the simple things they were able to do before they lost these limbs, right? So, I mean, there's, I think, great things that science can do to give people their peace of mind back. I mean, that's a very interesting topic as well. What are your thoughts on that, David, too?
Yeah, well, eyes is another thing that I've heard a little bit about, and it's very interesting. So they actually have been doing some experiments and studies and things like that to where they're restoring people's eyesights, and it's not always successful, but we're definitely headed in that direction. In the cases where they were successful, they found that it was very difficult for the patient to accept their new reality. At first, the ability to see is kind of a magical thing, and they enjoyed it. But then they began to notice that light post that they always knew was there, and they imagined in their mind what it was like, but it's not perfect. It's it's got scratches on it, it's got dents on it, it's got bumps on it, and that's it sounds weird, but that's how we begin to view the world when we can actually see versus what we imagine we're seeing. So it's apparently very difficult for people to recover their sight later in life to now accept what the world actually looks like versus what they imagine it to look like.
Right. And, you make me think of an example of Stevie Wonder. He's doesn't have his eyesight. I mean, he's definitely one of the greatest musicians of all time. He has an art that he's been able to create. He's learned different instruments, not being able to see them, not being able to play them. He's developed friendships that are lifelong lasting by not being able to see what people look like and judge them based on what they look like or dress like or, his perceptions of eyesight, right? So he's been able to use his other senses to judge people, right? Not just what he can see. So, I mean, being blind in that respect has allowed him to really be non-judging, I think, right? And really just see people for who they are, again, not with his eyes, but with his heart.
Yeah, he pretty much just smiles and has fun and plays music. It's what he's good at. So.
Right. Well, that's what we see, right? We don't see the back end of how Stevie Wonder lives.
No,
right?
there certainly could. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised at all if there was some toil and struggle and all that kind of stuff behind it. But that's kind of one of the things that makes us like him, right? Like his public facing image is so happy and upbeat in a way.
No, for sure, right? And I mean, it's knowing what those struggles behind the scenes are, right? And that's just, I think, the things that I'm trying to get when I'm saying what I'm saying is trying to get our listeners to think about is not just what we can see about, in this example, Stevie Wonder's life. It's trying to see past what we can see, right? Really think about if you could relate to him, if you had lost your eyesight, how would you see the world or sense the world, right? Would you sense the world and see the world just like Stevie Wonder does? Or would you, be more negative? I mean, the smile you see on his face is he's positive. He's accepted what he is, right? And how he is. And if you were to give him his eyesight back, it's an interesting question. Do you think he'd want it back?
Yeah. I don't know. Maybe he would jump at the opportunity, but now what is the long-term prospect of that? Maybe it's exactly as described. Everything that he thought was perfect or imagined to be perfect is not.
Right. So it's kind of neat, right, to live in a world that's just right for you. I think that's kind of what I was saying earlier. It's like, sometimes, we go at certain ages right now. We go at a certain age because that's kind of what our chance is, right? Some people, like I said, they live and they smoke and they drink and they abuse their own bodies with different drugs as well. And they live a lot longer than people who are healthy.
Sometimes.
Right? And, these things do happen, not all the time, absolutely. But we do hear about these cases. But, it is a thing of chance, right? So even to have if you lose your limbs, I mean, it's an experience, not saying, and I can't even speak from that because I have all my 10 toes and I have all my fingers and I have my legs and my arms and my head and all my hair and everything, right? So relatively speaking, my body is perfect, right? So it's very tough for me to say, it's an experience for somebody to lose their arm. It's very tough, but I do think the people that are able to understand what happened and move on past it will see their loss of their arm or limbs as an experience to be lived and trying, right? I mean, I've seen people who draw with their feet and their paintings sell for thousands of dollars.
Play guitar with their feet.
Absolutely, right? So there's so many different things the human body can accomplish without having your hands to play guitar or you know what I mean? So I think it's if you have to be able to accept that, one, you've lost your limbs and then be able to figure out ways to move forward. Right now, I'm not saying that I would be able to at all because I don't even know what that feeling would be like. God forbid that ever happens to me, right? But if it ever did, I mean, it's a challenge that anybody who would lose their limbs would have to go through. And I think in that point of things, having a strong family base really helps. Now, if there is a way to have science and technology come in and help that way, it's your choice to want it, I think.
True. A part of what you're speaking to, and I'm sorry, I am going to go on another tangent and also talk about the hypothetical.
Hey, that's okay. That's the whole show about tangents.
There's, people fall on different camps with this, but we'll say that, some people believe basically we're only tapping into 5% of our human potential, not necessarily a brain, just our human potential in general. We're only tapping into about 5% of it and 95% of it is dormant and we don't know how to harness it. Now, potentially, you had the thing about aliens earlier. It could also be an explanation for how in earlier times we were able to live longer, or in earlier times we were able to build the pyramids or do Stonehenge, all that kind of stuff, because we don't necessarily have an explanation for a lot of that. But the reason I bring that up is because of the many layers to being a human. You know, if it's just the physical, if this is it, I think a lot of us sense a lot more going on than just what's happening in our environment physically. You know, there would be no need to talk about law of attraction or religion or spirituality if we didn't sense that maybe there was another layer potentially to this existence of ours. And if we're only using 5%, we can't necessarily see all those layers, but we're at least tapping into them.
Right. You know, and it's funny, David, one of the ideas or points that I wrote down was talking about reincarnation. Right. So, I mean, if, for example, let's say through science and technology, we're able to live forever. You know, one of the things that you talked about earlier was to, you know, if the planet had 20, 30, 40, 50 billion people, eventually you would just have one of two things happen. You would either keep creating, or you'd eventually have to stop creating people because now you've just had too many people, right? So that's another moral thing that I've actually had a couple different points I want to start talking about a little bit later when we're ready to talk about. But one of the things with reincarnation, I think that helps people. And again, that gets somewhat into spirituality, somewhat into God. I don't know how deep or interrelated those topics really are. I mean, I'm assuming that a lot of people do believe that they've been on this planet before, on a different planets before, and have met certain people, and do believe that, you know, somewhere down the line, even for me and you, for example, we've been friends before, and we've maybe not recorded these talks, but we've had similar gatherings and we've talked about these things, and we've had these type of conversations before. It's funny, and it's very interesting, because I think if you take that away, then you also take away potentially hope as well. Maybe you take away hope for a better existence, but maybe this is what also religion preaches to us, right? So then that comes to me, well, then how does this 5% of our brain, how are we only able to use 5% of the brain and have 95% turned off? Well, who turned it off then, right? And does that affect the way we think? Does that affect the way we aged?
Yeah, that's exactly where I wanted to go with this next. all that kind of stuff is super relevant, because if age becomes less of a factor, what does that realistically mean for jobs, for relationships, for beliefs? Things that we've been taught through religion and society and media. Doesn't it really, it's actually a paradigm breaking thing if suddenly we're all living to be 120, 140, 160 and possibly beyond. Because what about jobs? It's paradigm breaking because most of us think, quote unquote, retirement age is 65. Now, you and I, Maveen, know that retirement's like a dollar amount. Really, realistically, it's not an age. But if we were accepting of the fact that retirement age is 65 and you're going to live to be 140, you still need money coming in realistically, right? Like if we still have the same society we have today, assuming we're still capitalistic and still democratic, at least in this particular region of the world, well, you're going to need money to live to that age. Doesn't that make it really challenging?
I think you're right, and that's one of the things I wrote down too, right? Most studies show as of right now that, again, like I said, people are living longer than we used to live, but again, we're still passing at, 68 as an average age, right? Let's say 72, I think, was males. I think women still live longer than men. But you're right. If we don't have enough money to buy stuff today, most people are living on credit today. Most people are living paycheck to paycheck just today. So what happens when you get, 30 years out longer than your expected age to live, right? How are you going to take care of yourself then? Who's taking care of you? Is the government taking care of you? And if that's the case, then I do have some other points to talk about that, which I can affect the way things happen, but again, if you're able to take care of yourself, again, money will only, it's not real necessarily, right? It's what we perceive to be able to buy things it's with, right? So, but I guess if you're going 30, 40 years out, what makes you think we even need to buy food anymore?
Yeah, exactly. And as far as like how it would be paradigm breaking to like relationships, I don't really subscribe to this, but I heard this somewhere, which was that in marriage, the guy is trying to get out and goes through hell in the first 10 years. And in the second decade, the woman's trying to get out and go through hell. In the third decade, they're both going through hell. And then fourth decade, everything's great. It's a crazy way of thinking about marriage to me. I'm not married, so I couldn't really tell you if that's the case or if there's any truth to that or not. But you're basically putting a time frame on it. You're saying 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, and then we're going to be dead. But if you're living to be 120, that's not true, is it? You have many more decades ahead of you. So what does that mean for a relationship? Especially like a marriage?
Right. Well, if we were to take all the things that we do right now in our marriages now, and at least I'm married, so I can at least speak to that. And I guess, general population speaking, we all go to work. We all work hard at work. And what are we doing it for, right? To create a life to pass, I believe, to the next generation, right? To our kids, and then our kids' kids, and see that family wealth go down the line, generation, on your family tree, right?
Absolutely.
If we're going to look at what we're talking about biblical earlier, even God killed his own son, Jesus, to save the world, right? So he had to crucify him to show that death is real. So were people living longer than Jesus at the time? I don't know, or not. But one of the things you have to look at is why these things happen. Now, if I'm on the 40-40 plan, and for those who don't know what the 40-40 plan is, it's work 40 hours a week for 40 years to retire and then die later. Right?
Yes.
Now, if I'm living longer, would my 40-40 plan now turn into a 60-year plan, a 70-year plan, an 80-year plan? Is that what we're here to do, is just work? I think that's not true to the answer. I think and I know, most entrepreneurs know that we're not here just to work. I think we're here to do something bigger and better than work for somebody else. I think working for ourselves is definitely one of the things. And I don't mean working for somebody else in a negative way, because I feel by putting these podcasts out, we are working for our listeners as well, right?
Yeah.
We're working to help improve their lives, or at least enhance their thinking as well, right? So just depending on how you look at work. But I know for most people, like I was saying before, if time is slowed down when they're in school and when they're at work, would they want to go to work for another 30, 40 years and feel like time is just slowing down, because now they're healthier, they're able to work longer, work harder, be stronger, lift more, work longer days? So what are you really creating? A society of slavery?
Well, I think in some ways that's exactly what we've had for so many years, is a society of slavery. That's why you often hear me talk about the system of control. It's dangerous to make an assumption about the system of control, because do we know that it's real? Can we confirm it? No, but we can see evidence of it. And that's why I talk about it, right? That's why we've talked about it with pharmaceuticals. It is a system. I mean, I can't see it any other way. It is a system of control. It's just trying to get people into a subscription program to pay the healthcare industry money.
Right. Well, one of the things to think about is, if, let's say, for example, you're able to develop organs and stockpile organs, and let's say one day you're just able to order a heart on the internet and do your own transplant, for example. Because my assumption would be, one, science and doctors want to make money. The pharmaceuticals industry want to make money. So are they going to give us faulty hearts that we have to replace every 5 years, let's say, or do we have to take now medicine to make sure that heart stays working with our bodies forever? So, that's one of the things that I was thinking about too.
Subscription heart.
Yeah, well, you know what I mean, right? I mean, that's just one thing, right? Just look at the lung, and then really, are you becoming artificial technology, AI, or are they going to develop artificial technology, or are they going to have some sort of hybrid where we become a hybrid of artificial intelligence?
Well, AI is coming. That is another thing that I've heard a little bit about recently. I think it was on the Accidental Creative podcast. And, one of the interesting conclusions he came to was that, we think creativity is something fairly unique to human beings, but he's saying that AIs are probably going to be capable of producing beautiful and wonderful things just the way human beings are. And in fact, our greatest strengths will be unlocked when human beings and AI work together. So the best pairing, it's not that human beings are better than AI, and it's not that AI is better than human beings, but when you pair them together, you have a force that's pretty crazy.
Right. So we become the AI. So it's interesting to think, because then if you start thinking about how aging will also work into to wars as an example, right? So now you have bodies that have, hybrids of our human bodies and an artificial intelligence. And how does that work into war? Then are you really able to kill the people that you are in war against, right? So, or do people like come back like zombies, or what really starts happening, right? I mean, you have to start thinking about that. Like, do you think wars, I think, happen over because of control? So if they're trying to control something, then I think the wars not only become supposedly about religion, but really have the background of oil and resources. Now they become about resources of pharmaceutical wars. So are people going to start, having wars for those things instead, right? So
That feels
gets in there.
That feels like something that could definitely happen in the future as a pharmaceutical war. Yes.
Right. And you can already see that kind of happening, right? I know I was watching CNN with the debates that have been happening in the U.S. And by the time this episode releases, those debates will be done, and we'll have either Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump in, right? So
thank God it's over.
Yeah, well, absolutely. It's going to happen, right? So then what do you do there, right? So that's what kind of makes me think about with prescription medicine now. Will you even need the pharmaceutical industry? Let's say, for example, they're able to develop the perfect thing that you only need to change one time, that organ, and you have the perfect organ forever. Your body will accept it because they'll probably do some sort of genetic testing with you and for you, whatever. But let's say they go ahead and make that perfect. So down the road, will there be a need for the pharmaceutical industry at all, other than the creation of organs? And after a while, if you stop, let's say, for example, giving birth to people because you really don't need to, because all the people on this planet today are all we really need, is there a need to have more people being born into our world?
I think we can answer that, or I can answer that question by posing another question. What if most of the healthcare industry was replaced with naturopaths as opposed to people peddling drugs?
Right. Well, even in naturopath, it's not going to necessarily make you live to 120, 130, 150, 200 years old, right? It's not an answer to live forever, ever. It's an answer
and I don't think anybody's claiming to be that necessarily.
Right. No, not at all. And they're not, right? But that's what I mean. So even if you were taking a more holistic lifestyle and, into, Chinese medicine or Indian medicine and medicine from the native Indians of this planet, and then looking into forests and really looking at plants and different herbs on how to make yourself better. Let's say it prolongs your life, but realistically, again, I think it still puts it up to chance again. It's not something that we can necessarily fully control. I think we can have a great way to prolong our life using these items every day and whatnot. But again, sometime you will pass, because there's nothing that's going to stop you from getting hit by a bus tomorrow or by a car or being stabbed by somebody, right? So these things, no matter if you take a holistic lifestyle or not, can still happen to you.
Well, and to your point about war, though, like, we've been lucky somewhat in that much of it has been localized in recent years, and the fighting is happening on the grounds of that particular country. But we've known for many decades now, ever since the creation and proliferation of nuclear warfare, that if it was not localized and somebody hit the wrong buttons or hit them intentionally, the world would more or less be over. I mean, we might have some survivors, but definitely the world as we know it would be over in the constructs that we have.
No, you're right. And I mean, then I guess science and technology would win, because they would come back to recreate the populations if there were people who survived. Now, I'm not sure if you've ever watched the show Walking Dead or whatnot, but I mean, it does give you a great example of what life could look like, where things are people have been extinct. But it's interesting to see that nature would continue without us as well.
Yeah, and the interesting metaphor about zombies is, like, they already live among us, so guys, don't wait and expect them to show up. You just have to go to, like, your city's downtown or industrial complex, and you see people walking by who are dead on the inside, and those are real life zombies.
No, for sure. And it's just a different way of looking at people, right? And
yeah.
And again, we're not trying to judge anybody. I think we're just trying to show that there are people, just staring at their phones constantly, right? I mean, that's a reality of this world, right? With the option of having a cell phone in your hand, you're connected constantly to people all across the planet, across the world, or even sitting next to you. I know we were at a dinner the other day and watching people kind of just interact. I love watching people. I love the sociology side of things, and just kind of watching how people were talking. I mean, 3 out of 4 people were on their phones messaging somebody else, and the one person was just sitting there kind of waiting for these people, I think, to wake up and have a conversation with each other versus having that conversation with somebody who couldn't make it. Now, again, if they were planning, one person I could see planning for somebody else to come or trying to give them directions or something, but 3 people having 3 separate conversations with potentially 3 different people about 3 different topics really doesn't show me that people are connected the way science, I think, has wanted us to connect and the way technology has wanted us to connect.
It's very true. I mean, what good does it do to live an extra 40, 60 years just so you can be on Facebook for another extra 40, 60 years? and this is the reality that we live in. Like, I'm sorry to say, but I feel like you're going to look back on life and go, like, why the hell did I waste so much time on Facebook or social media? I agree. It has some power. It has its place. It has its value. But at the same time, if that's where the majority of your time is being spent, and these phones are constructed to be addictive, so don't blame yourself for that. Obviously, there's people working behind the scenes to make this more addicting by the day, both Facebook and smartphones. But it's the same thing for me. Yeah, I'm often sitting at tables waiting for the conversation to start. And like, why are we here together? If you just want to go talk to this other person, go to their place. I don't care. You know?
Well, it's true, right? I mean, these are just the things, right? And that's with the times that we've gone through. I mean, you got to think back when, hundreds and even thousands of years ago, and even going back to cavemen, they sat around the fire, from what I can understand. They didn't have anything. They stared into the sky. They weren't looking at anything else, right? Life was about day to day. Yeah, they weren't living paycheck to paycheck, kind of how a lot of people live today with that 40-40 plan that a lot of people are on. But they were on a survival plan, right? They were on a day by day, maybe a 40-hour plan or a 2-hour plan to see what would happen next. Would they be able to get their next meal or not, right? So, I mean, there's things that have been happening for millennium. Now, I guess the best way to stop that would be to, make people live forever. I really do believe that. Now, I guess then you have to be able to get all the people that live forever to be constructive and be progressive in our society as well, right? I think if we were going to going back to the idea of space exploration, if you were going to travel to the vast ends of the universe and leave our own solar system, you'd have to be able to live forever. Because as we know, our body will age in space, fast or slow, with prescription pharmaceuticals or not, with the right food and nutrition or not, our bodies and cells will age, right? And I think that's kind of why, if you look at things, our cells die, people lose their hair, they turn white or gray. I've been blessed, not to have any of that happen. I'm very happy, but I'm not cynical to believe that I won't eventually one day be fully white hair, or maybe lose my hair or whatever, right? Or other limbs, who knows, right? I don't know what life's going to bring, but I think that's the cool part of it, not knowing, right? Where having a telephone in your face, I guess to a lot of people feels like they can be in the know constantly, they can be connected constantly, but they're really just connected through artificial intelligence. They're not really connected through one-on-one intelligence.
Yeah, because, I mean, you hear so many stories, or some of the books that we read, right? Like where this couple has 2 babies, and the 2 babies are placed in 2 separate, not cradles, but whatever it is that they use at the hospitals. And the one is weak and dying, and the other one is fine and healthy. So they put the one that's fine and healthy with the one that's dying in the same, bed or whatever it is. And then that one becomes whole and healthy too, because of that support and the closeness and everything else. And that's, I have never heard of anything that's more illustrative of how human beings work. When we're supportive, when we're caring, when we interact and communicate with each other, we thrive. When we don't have that, we lose a reason and a purpose to live.
No, you're right, and I think that can be seen in animal kingdoms as well, not just in the human kingdoms. They've done, I think, studies and experiments when they've taken monkeys and stuff and taken the mother away out of the situation and just put like a doll and that baby monkey holds on for dear life, and wants that closeness as well, right? So there's something to be said about being close to somebody, right? And then you got to think as well, if we're going to continue to age, let's say we continue to age progressively, I think what you were saying earlier about having 30, 40 million or billion people on this planet would eventually happen, right? And because as we're aging, let's say we age still the same way we continually age right now, right? 1 year equals 1 year, right? Eventually you'd have the people who are 18, or let's say being born today, and today was their starting day, those people would eventually be 120. There'd be no one left to be a baby. So the example of hospitals being needed for birth would not be needed anymore, because there's no one being born anymore, because there's no one dying anymore. You'd eliminate graveyards? Absolutely. And I mean, there's some positives in that as well, because if you're going to feed 30 billion people, you're going to need that space to grow food, right? And the graveyards can be used because it's land. Now, the graveyards that we have right now probably won't, but then that goes into waste as well. So if we're producing more food, well, where do we put all this waste? Is it being wasted? Is it being recycled? Or is there a way to consume the whole thing? Or like I was saying earlier, would there even be a need for food?
Yeah, I think it would be a new way of life, because all of our resources would be depleted, or the resources that we use now, we'd basically have to tap into new ways of doing it. Like, we'd still have shelter probably in some form because we would need it, but the homes as we know them now, or houses as we know them now, without electricity don't exactly function that great. It's just a place to be without electricity.
Right. But before electricity was brought into the reality for many people, people existed without it.
Yes.
Right. They would use some sort of kerosene lamps and the sun as the number one. Right. And I don't know if it was more peaceful at that time or not. But people weren't necessarily watching TV because there was no TVs at that time. So, just over the last 100 and maybe now 20 years has life really began to change and looked much different than it ever did.
Yeah, exactly. And this whole thing about technology and cell phones kind of just made me think of a song by Daniel Amos called "The Youth with a Machine." I think it was written in the 80s, but I mean, that's never been more relevant. That's exactly what we're seeing everywhere we go. You walk into a coffee shop, you walk into a bar. What is it? Youth with a machine. They're just staring at their screens.
Right. Well, it's funny. I think you've had this conversation. I don't remember if we've actually recorded this conversation or we just had this conversation in passing, but I was mentioning to you, like, we've grown up with something in our hands always. Growing up in the 80s, I had a Walkman in my hand. People remember cassette tapes. Moving into the 90s, had a CD player in my hands.
Discman.
Yeah, and then moving into the late 1990s, I had an iPod in my hand.
Yep.
And now I have a cell phone in my hand, right? So my whole life has consisted of holding some sort of electronic. And you got to think, will this be something that, I guess, would you even need to hold any more electronics if you can implant, for example, if you can develop, organs, for example, then what stops us from implanting, speakers into our heads and into our brains, or being kind of like the Matrix and downloading all the music? So if we want to listen to it, you just listen to it in your own headspace and don't need to wear headphones anymore, right? I mean, I think that's where that artificial intelligence starts coming in, and we start turning into robots or partial robots, right? I mean, you can see where people wear hearing aids, for example, and you'll see how part of that, I've seen people wear that, and I don't know the full science behind it, so I do apologize to our listeners, but you'll see sometimes where people have their head shaved and they'll have this little circular disc that's kind of implanted in their head, and which allows them to hear, right? So, I mean, what stops us from creating things that would eventually be able to implant right into our heads to listen to music, right? Or do other things?
Yeah, I think in some ways we are headed in that direction too. We had a discussion not long ago at the question community about the cloud in the future, but that's one of the things, like Internet of Things, right? The IoT. Basically, it used to, one of the problems was that it was so gaudy, people wouldn't really want to wear it. But now we've created fashionable IoT that people would want to wear and embed into their mind, or embed into their bodies in some way, shape, or form. So, I mean, that's a whole other discussion, but it is crazy. And I mean, maybe that'll play into aging as well in some way.
Right. And you make me think about something that I had heard long time ago, and I'm sure you've heard it as well, and I'm sure our listeners have heard of it to some extent. And I think someone in France had actually gotten this done as well, but it was getting a computer chip embedded in their skin, as they refer to as the mark of the beast, right? So,
Yep.
I mean, that starts she's showing like what people are willing to do, one, if they're scared, two, if you allow government to have control, right? And I think if you let science and technology control how you age and how you will ultimately become and who you will ultimately become, I think you'll be controlled as well in that process.
Well, part of it is a question, and I think it's in some ways the biggest question, and I'm sure we're kind of reaching the point where we're going to wrap up anyway, but that question is, do you really want to live forever? Or if not forever, do you really want to live an extra 40, 60 years or more? And, I think I can live to be 120, and I believe that 60 could be my mid-age, and I could enjoy a nice, long, healthy, joyful, productive life. But I know that also there's a lot of people with the attitude that, no, I mean, having experienced so many of the challenges and difficulties and problems that I've had to go through this point, why would there has to be an end to this thing, because this is crazy. And so I understand that perspective as well. You could be in a lot of pain and a lot of difficulty. We all experience that in life, and we can't really compare somebody's pain to our own pain, because it's different, and what's difficult for them might be easy for us.
Right.
But those are the kind of the questions I'm sure that people will be thinking about is, do I really want to live longer if I had the opportunity?
Right. Well, you make me think about my mom for a second, because, she's been living with arthritis for a very, very long time. And, her knees are very bad. And I mean, they're getting, they're at points where she's having a very difficult time walking. Now, if there was something, she's not at a point where she needs a knee replacement, but she's not at the point where she's comfortable and happy either in her day-to-day walk. So she's looking for different ways to heal her own body, because the doctors are saying, well, you don't need a knee replacement at this point. We don't want to put you through an operation and through all that pain, and having to learn how to walk again, I mean, is a big thing, right? So, I mean, you also, like I was mentioning with Stevie Wonder, if you're used to living one way, I think, there's something to be said. I don't know what's right or what's wrong, and I don't think anybody can, because a lot of our experiences are based on what we've seen for the last, whatever our life has been so far, right? I'm 38 years old, and my experience is only based on what I've seen and what I've heard and read. I can't see into the future, and
it's all new.
It's all new, right? And we can't really think about, we can think about it, but I don't think we can really truly understand what living another 40, 50 years. And if you're going to live another 40, 50 years, then why do we have to die at this 30, 40, 50 year mark either? What makes us say we have to die? Because all we're saying is helping science help us age, let's say, nicely into our 100s and 50s and 200s. But why do we have to die at that age? Then the question becomes, well, why can't science make us live longer? Getting to that potential 900 plus years that we hear about in the Bible, right? And at different times and different things that you read, right? So, and then when you live that 200-300 years old, and you got that healthy body, and you're able to go out and experience things that you had never experienced, because again, the world would probably continually change. What would make you want to die and not experience that?
Yeah, it definitely goes both ways, and it's really hard to say without having experienced it. And if the mind can only accept, and I take this with a grain of salt for sure, but if the mind can only accept so many memories and store so much information before it's kind of overloaded, then how many flashbacks are you going to have to the past? Or is the past now become much less clearer than it once was? And without documenting and writing down what happened, you wouldn't even remember anymore. Maybe some of the people that you met, some of the relationships that you had and stuff like that. But I guess you'd have to talk to somebody that's lived to be 120 to know.
Well, and that's 120 based on the technology we have right now.
Yeah.
You were mentioning earlier that we only use 5% of our brain, but if we're able to open up that
really
capacity,
just like human potential, maybe not our brain, but like 5%.
Let's say human potential, and I believe it's also part of your brain as well.
I think it is.
Yeah, but let's say we are able to use 5%, and let's say what makes us think that if we can age gracefully and not pass away? What makes us think if science is able to, let's say, make these organs for us, why can't then science help us open up the remainder of that 95% that we're not using, right? So then maybe you are able to then store those memories a lot longer and go back into those memories and really go back into facts and, oh, how did I really say that? Because I know I've had conversations where I've said certain things and I don't remember, the exact words I've used. I just loosely remember the conversation. I'm not going to remember the exact tone I use and but if you're able to use the rest of your mind, maybe you can remember the whole tone and the whole conversation and even remember feeling, because sometimes people forget the feelings they had or were witnessing somebody else have while something was happening between the two or more people.
I think that would totally make sense.
Yeah, I do too, and you got to look at, I think all of the big picture, what science would be able to do. Now, again, we all both understand that we have in our pharmaceutical talk, there's a lot of money to see people die, unfortunately, and I don't think they have an agenda to see people live really long lives, because we do have, I believe they have an agenda to make money off of misery, unfortunately.
Yes.
But again, with that said, I think people have to be the judge for themselves and really see what they want to see that's going on or not going on.
Yeah, exactly. I think we got to fight for worthy causes. Nothing worth fighting for really does come without that fight and that effort and that determination to see it become a reality. So who's to say this technology they would want to make us available to us? Who's to say they want to make that science and breakthroughs available to us? I mean, they've already thrown us curveballs multiple times. Today, healthy is coffee. Tomorrow, coffee is the worst thing you could possibly drink. And then the next year, coffee produces cancer. And then the next year, coffee gives you more brain power. I mean, just stop. Maybe all of it's true and none of it's true, but not all of it can be true.
Right. Well, I think a lot of it does come down to the supposed research that they do on these things and the combination, right? I mean, up until a few years ago, I had no reason to mix coffee with butter and with coconut oil.
That's new,
and
right?
CT oil, but somebody thought of it and somebody did the science and did the work behind it, and I believe it's Dave Asprey, from what I understand, anyways, who came out with this idea, or at least marketed the idea and has opened coffee shops and to sell this product that people have seen huge benefits from, right? So it's not adding the sugars, it's not adding the creamers, right? The stuff that's
artificial sweeteners.
That's artificial, right? It's adding the coconut oil from a coconut. It's adding clarified butter, which is supposed to be good fats for our body and our brains, because again, our brain lives on fats. It doesn't live on necessarily. I don't know the exact science again behind it, but I'm sure it needs proteins, it needs carbs, but it does also need fats for you to think and use that stored energy in your mind as well.
Yeah, basically it enhances those ketones.
Right. Well, exactly. And the other thing we were talking about more and more too, that you'll start seeing in science as well, is the idea of nootropics as well, right? And I think we've had these conversations as well a little bit, just kind of ins and outs and not really major conversations, but we've kind of thrown the idea around as well, where people, in our last episode, I know one of our last episodes, we're talking about people using drugs such as acid to even enhance their mind or the mind's capabilities. Now, are they using more than that supposed 5%? Are they going into that dark matter to bring that into the 5%? I don't really know. I don't have my brain hooked up. I'm not going to start doing acid to figure that out. But I mean, there are people who are willing to do it and are willing to be the science experiments on seeing how these things work as well.
Yeah, those are some really great points. Did you have more there, Maveen?
I do, just kind of some closing thoughts, maybe some thoughts that people can think about, on the idea of why I feel, that I don't know if I'd want to live to 200, 300, 400, maybe because I've never seen anybody live that high. You don't really know what the experience is like for anybody to live that long. So there's really no base point to understand. I mean, if I could live to 100, I'd be happy. If I could live to 120, I'd be happy. Do I want my name in the Guinness Book of World Records? Well, based on some of the stats, 18 out of 19 when I looked at it were women, so my chances are probably pretty slim to be in that.
We could figure that, like science and technology could even figure out that gender difference and why women would live longer too, right? But
absolutely, right? But one of the things I'd like our listeners to think about is, if we were to have, say, no more people being born, right? I know in my generation and your generation, every 10 to 15 years, the new best emerges. So the new best salespeople, the new best sports figures, the new best scientists, the healthcare professionals, better actors keep coming. People who, doesn't matter what industry you look at, the best people come. Better minds, people who win Nobel Peace Prizes, people who win science, just win these awards in science, right? That come with these breakthroughs that we're able to do, right? So if we're not able to create more people because we're aging everybody so, progressively into their 200-300s, you'd only have all the same minds thinking, and not necessarily would we ever be able to create a new mind to come up with new ways of doing things or new records being broken. Eventually, you'd have the same records, right? Eventually that 100-meter would stick, right? No one would be able to break it because, again, unless we're taking performance-enhanced drugs or some sort of things, we're talking about natural ways of breaking it, right?
Unless aging actually means to get better. And we don't know that, right? If we're only living to be 80, 60 or whatever, we don't actually know what part of aging makes us better. So I don't know if that's necessarily true.
Well, I can take a look at the Olympics as an example, right? You can put up someone like a Safa Powell against any 80-year-old, and I guarantee you that 30-year-old or late 20s man will beat any 80-year-old right now.
Currently, yeah.
Off the bat, right? So, that's natural talent or natural ability. Now, if we're talking about science coming in, well, that's not natural anymore, right? We're not talking
that's
apples to apples.
That's not necessarily true. Like if you have the right foods, the right supplements, the right herbs and that kind of stuff, it's no different than what an athlete does. They consume things that allow them to perform at their best.
Right, and I think they do that. You can look at hockey players even today, for example, right? Look at hockey players like Wayne Gretzky. When in his prime, I'm sure he was healthy, he was eating right, he probably had somebody cooking for him all the time and maybe making healthy meals for him so he can perform at his peak performance. Now, with natural aging, there came to an age where he needed to retire. His body could not take the physicality of being hurt. You look at someone like Chris Chelios, played well into his 40s, because he was able to, right? You look at boxers, look at Muhammad Ali, box as long as he could, but look at what happened to him after taking enough punches, right? If we're talking the natural ability, not talking about, I'm sure you could have, all these different athletes could have eaten any sort of herbs and had a allopathic lifestyle, but eventually the punishment their bodies take would show.
I agree to some extent. I think part of that is just the construct that we have. We eat foods that cause inflammation. We don't know really the best ways to eat. We have pains in our body and we just begin to accept them without really looking into why those pains actually exist. So there are many reasons for me to believe that's not necessarily the case, but we don't have to agree on this point. So.
No, for sure. We don't have to agree, and that's the beauty of this show, right? Is not being able to agree on every point. If we were to agree on everything, we're the exact same person, right?
Exactly.
But with that said, one of the things I want you to think about too, and I want myself to think about what you're saying, and I want our listeners to really listen to both sides of the story and really judge for themselves, right? But, there are, if you look at all athletes that are natural, even bodybuilders, right? For example, these are people who we consider the pinnacle of what fitness should be like, and being able to lift, lots of weight or potentially being chiseled and low fat. To be able to get to that, you have to have a very, very clean diet. You cannot consume carbs that are not healthy for you and sugars in order to look like a weightlifter looks like, right? Yeah. So you have to understand, in my thinking, even look at football players, for example. You look at some of these guys, how fast they can run 100 meters or 200 meters. These guys are running fast and able to do things that, people that eat unhealthy are able to not do, right? So if we look at some of the best athletes, just looking at the athlete side of things, you have to think that they have some of the best diets as well compared to most people on this planet, I would have to think.
I think it's a fair point. I just think it has the potential to change. based on our better understanding of the human body.
Absolutely. I think we're talking two different things. If you're talking about potential to change, absolutely. I do feel people can still be better, just changing the way they eat. But I think if we're going to look at it, I think there is a point where if we're just looking at naturally aging, even if you take all the herbs on this planet and consume them, there's still going to be a point where you will, I think, hit a wall or a ceiling where you will not be any better because, again, some of us don't have the natural talent based on DNA to be the best sprinters in the world and be the Michael Jordans and the Wayne Gretzky's and the...
But I'm saying, like, that's the beauty of science and technology. It keeps advancing beyond what we think is possible or where we think we are as human beings or what our bodies are capable or not capable of. Again, if we're unlocking the full 95%, the other 95% of human potential, then all these things might be imagined limitations. It's possible. I'm not saying it is, but it's possible.
Well, for sure. And, I'll just do one of the other comparisons as well is I'm just thinking about if you take a Paralympic athlete versus an athlete that, doesn't have any deformities or missing a limb or whatever, and you put them side by side. I mean, there's records that have been broken, I think, by Paralympics that even able-bodied athletes are not able to do. So, I mean, there's something to be said in that side of things as well. But a lot of that I do feel is genetics. It is, part of it is that as well, right? I mean, part of it is diet, part of it is science, because you got to think someone who has an artificial limb and is able to perform is technically an AI specimen, is an artificial intelligent specimen who is performing either in swimming or in say shot put or in running or something, right? So you have to look at that as well, and that's just showing you what science is able to do with people's bodies as well. I do think that's a great representative if you want to see where science and technology can take sports, at least, right? I mean, if we ever look at acting, right, for example, I know we're probably going to go a little over, but if we look at something like acting, some of the best actors came in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s and the 50s in the 60s. Well, and if we stop now producing people as an example, or stop who could be the next best actors that we haven't seen yet, right? I'd love to have Al Pacino be the best actor forever and Robert De Niro and stuff, but I do think there's new actors and new talent and new emotion that can be shown on the big screen, or even to a guy like you that's a music guy, right? There's so much more music that can be created. Now if we have science and technology, I think, come in there and put their hands in there and change the way people live, maybe the people who create that music in that shorter span of time. If you look at somebody like Kurt Cobain from Nirvana, he produced such great music in such a short span of time. Yeah, he had some stuff to deal with. Yeah, he took his own life, but he still made an impact on this world in such a small amount of time. Now, if you allowed everybody to live for longer periods of time, would that take away the ambition people have?
It could. I think that's a really important discussion and something I was thinking about bringing up, but we have chatted for over an hour at this point.
Well, I know we can go forever. So one of the last things I will say is one of the last points I had on here was, if we were to continue to feed the world and have to feed the world, I think one of the things more and more people are talking about and thinking about is genetically modified foods. So if we were having to feed 20, 30 billion people on this planet eventually someday, I think more and more would we have genetically modified food to have to be consumed by people, and less would there be natural foods left, because we would need then the spaces in the rainforests to grow this food eventually, or in labs, in labs or rainforests, I guess, or land versus labs, depending on however you want to look at it, right? But the more we cut down our environment, the more we may lose our own planet.
Yeah, or we'll just have to get used to eating alternative things like trees.
Well, the trees are still consumable. So.
Yeah, so there you go. But yeah, that's been Using Your Power. We've been talking about aging, science, and technology. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. We look forward to hearing your thoughts. Honestly, it's a discussion that could go on and on and on and on, I'm sure. Anything else, Maveen?
No, not at all, David. I think that's a great episode that we've put together. I think we've really put some thought into it. I think we've put some thought into, for our listeners, to something to think about as well, right? And really maybe, question, maybe have discussions with their own friends and their colleagues and at work and over a cup of coffee with somebody and really start getting in deeper into conversation about what their thoughts are. I think more and more people are not having conversations about what they truly believe. And more people really just kind of going with the flow is what's happening. So that's my kind of final thought, or my third final thought, I guess.
So true. Well, thanks so much for joining us, and we'll connect with you again next time.
Thank you.